The torn Honduran passport slid across the polished marble floor of the executive office like a dry leaf in autumn. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, watched the shredded document at her feet as the cold Chicago wind stirred the silk curtains through the cracked window on the 47th floor. The yellowed pages revealed the face of a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 crosses. The name was blurred by moisture, but she could just make it out. Miguel Alejandro Herrera. The photo had been taken years ago, back when there was still hope in that game. Victoria slowly bent down, her fingers trembling as they touched the damp paper. It wasn't the first time she'd seen documents. Over the past few months, undocumented workers had become almost invisible in her company, cleaning the offices after hours, delivering meals through the hallway, tending the gardens around the corporate complex. She always looked away, pretending not to notice the fear etched on their face whenever a supervisor approached. This time was different. Passport hadn't fallen here by accident. Before we dive into this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, enjoy the story. Victoria raised her eyes and found Miguel standing in the doorway, holding a broom with his calloused hand. He wore the blue uniform of the outsourced cleaning, but his shoulders were hunched as if he carried an invisible burden. The silence between them stretched on for long seconds, thick with a tension neither of them could name. "Sorry, ma'am," he murmured in accented English, his gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't mean to bother you." Victoria gripped the passport more firmly, feeling the paper start to crumble between her fingers. There was something familiar about that face, about his hesitant voice. A distant memory began to surface in her mind, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark. "You dropped this," she said, holding the document out to him. Miguel hesitated before stepping close. His movements were cautious, like someone used to moving through the shadow. When he reached out to take the passport, Victoria noticed a deep scar across his wrist, a mark that told a story of pain she couldn't decipher. "Thank you," he whispered, quickly slipping the document into the pocket of his shirt. But Victoria couldn't look away from him. There was something about the way he held the broom, the way he avoided her eye, that stirred a strange feeling in her chest. It was as if a door long sealed shut was being forced open. "Miguel," she said, testing his name on her tongue. "How long have you been working?" He seemed surprised that she knew his name. "3 months, ma'am. I work the night. Usually you're gone by the time I get." Victoria nodded slowly. 3 months. Exactly the same amount of time she'd started finding little odd things in her office. Wildflowers discreetly left in her vase. Fresh coffee waiting for her on the hardest morning. Important papers she'd misplaced mysteriously arranged on her desk. "Do you have family?" she asked, surprised at her own curiosity. Miguel's face closed off like a curtain being drawn. "No, ma'am, just me." But Victoria caught the hesitation in his voice, the way his fingers tightened around the broom. There was more to his story, hidden between the careful words he chose. The phone on her desk rang, shattering the moment. It was her assistant, reminding her about the investor meeting in 15 minutes. She picked up quick, and when she hung up, Miguel was already gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of pine and something subtle, maybe longing. She walked over to the window, watching the frantic motion of the city below. Chicago stretched out before her, like an empire she had built with her own hand. But right then, it all felt strangely hollow. The torn past cracked something in her carefully controlled reality, and through that crack, she was starting to glimpse a world she had always chosen to ignore. That night, Victoria stayed late in her office, pretending to work on financial reports. In truth, she was waiting to see Miguel again, to understand why a simple torn passport had awakened something in her heart she thought she'd buried long ago. When she finally heard the quiet footsteps in the hallway, her heart began to race in a way it hadn't in years. Before we dive into this story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching? Now, enjoy the story. At 11:30 at night, Victoria Sterling was still in her office, but this time she wasn't pretending to work. She had discovered something that would change everything. Miguel wasn't just another cleaning employee. For the past 3 months, he had been her invisible guardian angel. It all started when she decided to review the security camera footage. Officially, she was checking safety protocol. In truth, she needed to understand why she felt that someone was watching over her from the shadow. The black and white images revealed a truth that left her breath. Every morning at 5:50, Miguel arrived 2 hours before his scheduled shift. He didn't go straight to his cleaning duties. Instead, he would take the elevator up to the 47th floor and spend 40 minutes meticulously arranging Victoria's office. She watched transfixed as he gathered the papers she'd left scattered around, replaced the wilted flower, fresh ones he carried in a crumpled plastic bag, and brewed coffee exactly the way she liked, strong, no sugar, with a hint of cinnamon. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if he were pretending a sanctuary. But it was what happened in the footage from 3 weeks earlier that made Victoria's heart stop. On the grainy screen, she saw Miguel standing in front of the portrait of her mother, Elizabeth Sterling, the one that sat on the bookshelf behind her desk. He was holding something in his hand, folded, yellowed piece of paper. With trembling fingers, he unfolded what looked like an old letter, placed it beside the photo. Victoria paused the recording and zoomed in. Even with the poor video quality, she could recognize her mother's delicate handwriting on the letter. Her blood turned cold. How could Miguel have a letter from Elizabeth Sterling? Her mother had died 15 years ago when Victoria was just 22. She fast-forwarded and watched as Miguel pressed his fingertips to his lips and then touched the glass that protected the photograph. After that, he carefully tucked the letter away and went back to work as if nothing had happened. Victoria rewound and replayed this 3 more times, each viewing deepening the mystery. There was something familiar in the way Miguel looked at her mother's portrait, quiet intimacy that suggested a connection far deeper than she could comprehend. That night, she decided she had to confront. When she heard the familiar footsteps in the hallway, Victoria was waiting in the dim light of her office, a single lamp casting a pool of light across her desk. Miguel entered just as he always did, quiet, respect, but this time, she didn't hide. "Good evening, Miguel," she said soft, making him jump. He nearly dropped the bucket he was carrying. "Miss Sterling, I didn't know you were still here. I can come back later." "No." Victoria rose slowly to her feet. "Actually, I've been waiting for you." Miguel's face went pale in the low light. He gripped the broom handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I watched the security recordings," Victoria went on, studying every flicker of expression in his face. "I saw you taking care of my office. I saw you with my mother's photo." Miguel closed his eyes as if she'd struck. When he opened them again, tears were glinting in the dark depths of his gaze. "I can explain," he whispered, his voice thick with a pain Victoria didn't yet understand. "Then explain," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Tell me how you have a letter from my mother. Tell me why you've been taking care of me like you know me." Miguel set the broom aside and with trembling hand pulled the same yellowed letter from his shirt pocket, the one she had seen in the recording. He held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Your mother," he began, his voice break. "She saved." Victoria felt the floor shift beneath her. "What do you mean?" "I was 16 when I came to the United States," Miguel said, the words tumbling out in ragged bursts. "I came from Honduras alone. No paper, nothing. I was starving on the streets of Chicago when your mother found." He unfolded the letter with exquisite care, as though it were made of rose. "She gave me work in the garden at the Sterling estate. She taught me English. She treated me like a son." His voice cracked completely. "When she got sick, I took care of her during those last months. She gave me this letter before she died, and she made me promise one day I'd look after you." Victoria felt the world tilt around. Fragmented memories began to surface of a young gardener who was always there when she visited her mother during college. Someone her mother spoke of fondly, but whose name she'd never really registered. "You're the Miguel," she whispered, the realization crashing over her like a wave. "My mother always talked about a Miguel who took care of the garden, but I never—" "You never really saw me," he finished without resentment. "I was just another invisible work, but your mother, she saw me. She knew me." Victoria reached out a trembling hand toward the letter. May I read it?" Miguel hesitated for a moment, then placed the paper in her palm. Victoria's hand shook as she unfolded the words written in her mother's familiar script. "My dear Miguel, if you are reading, it means I am gone. My promise has become your responsibility. Victoria is stronger than she knows, but she is also more fragile than she appears. She will build walls around her heart. You know the way to tear them down. Take care of her as you took care of me. Show her that true love knows no border, no dock, no status. In your heart, you carry the key to her happiness. Use it when the time comes. With all my love and eternal gratitude, Elizabeth Sterling." By the time Victoria finished reading, tears were streaming freely down her face. 15 years of loneliness, of building an empire to fill the hollow her mother's death had left. And all this time, Elizabeth's last gift had been waiting patient in the shadow. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel gave her a sad smile. "Because you weren't ready. Your mother said I'd know when it was time." Victoria looked at the torn passport still sitting on her desk, then back at Miguel. Finally, she understood. The passport hadn't fallen by accident. It was a sign, a calling to finally see what had been right in front of her all along. Victoria Sterling couldn't sleep that. Her mother's letter lay open on her nightstand, the words dancing through her mind like ghosts from the past. By 5 in the morning, she gave up trying to rest and drove to the office, arriving even before Miguel. For the first time in 15 years, she wanted to be there when he walked in. Hidden behind the half-open door of a conference, Victoria watched as Miguel climbed the service instead of taking the main elevator. He carried the same crumpled plastic bag she'd seen on the security. Now she knew what it held. Fresh flowers, chosen just for her. When Miguel stepped into her office, Victoria felt her heart start to race. She watched him repeat the ritual he'd performed for 3 months, gathering the scattered papers into neat stacks, replacing the water in the vase, and arranging 3 white daisies, Elizabeth Sterling's favorite flower, a detail Victoria had forgotten until that very moment. But it was when Miguel approached her mother's portrait that Victoria felt tears prick her eye. He took from his pocket not only the yellowed letter, but also a small, faded photograph. It showed Elizabeth and Miguel standing in the garden at the Sterling estate, her arm draped affectionately around the young man's shoulder, both of them smiling genuinely at the camera. "Good morning, Doña Elizabeth," Miguel whispered to the portrait, his voice so full of tenderness it made Victoria's chest ache. "Your daughter is starting to see me. I think you were right. Maybe it really is time." Victoria couldn't hold back any longer. She pushed the door open and stepped into the office, making Miguel jump and nearly dropped the photo in his hand. "Don't stop," she said soft, walking toward him. "Please, keep going." Miguel hesitated, his gaze flickering between Victoria and Elizabeth's pic. Finally, he spoke again, his voice unsteady. "She's here with Doña Elizabeth. Your Victoria is here." He glanced at Victoria, then back at the portrait. "She has your eye, and your stubbornness too." Victoria let out a watery laugh, a laugh she hadn't heard from herself in years. "Did my mother really say that?" "Every day," Miguel replied with a shy smile, "especially when you used to call and complain that she was spending too much money on charity. She'd say, 'Miguel, my daughter has a heart as big as the world, but she's built walls so high around it she can't even find the door herself.'" The words hit Victoria like a punch to the gut. It was exactly the kind of thing Elizabeth would say, that mix of maternal love and exasperation she knew so well. "Can I see the photo?" Victoria asked, extending her hand. Miguel hesitated, then passed her the faded pic. Victoria took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. In the image, her mother looked young, happier than Victoria could remember seeing her in those last. And Miguel was just a boy, but there was already the same kindness in his eyes that she saw now. "When was this taken?" she asked. "On my 18th birthday. Doña Elizabeth said it was my American coming-of-age party." Miguel smiled, quiet nostalgia. "She baked a chocolate cake and sang happy birthday to me in Spanish. It was the first birthday I'd celebrated since leaving Honduras." Victoria pictured it all. Her mother, so polished and composed in public, singing in Spanish to a young immigrant in her garden. It was just like Elizabeth, doing grand acts of love when no one was watching. "Why did you leave Honduras?" Victoria asked, sitting in the chair next to Miguel, something she had never done with any employee. Miguel's face closed off, as if a shadow had crossed. "My father, he owed money to dangerous. When he couldn't pay, they said they would come after me and my little sister." His voice lowered. "My mother sold everything we had to get me to the United States. She told me to find work and bring my sister later." "And did you?" Victoria asked, though she could already hear the answer in his tone. "She died 2 years after I got yellow fever." Miguel closed his eye. "I was saving up to bring her, but it wasn't fast enough." Victoria felt as though someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart in their fist. "Miguel, I'm so sorry." "Doña Elizabeth was with me when I got the news," Miguel went on. "She held me while I cried and told me my mother would be proud of the man I was becoming. She said sometimes we lose the people we love, but the love they gave never died." The words hung in the quiet office. Victoria recognized her mother's wisdom, the way Elizabeth always knew exactly what to say in the hardest moment. "That's why you've been taken care of," Victoria said, not as a question, but as a realization, "because she asked you to." "At first, yeah," Miguel admitted, "but after a while," he trailed off, as if stepping onto dangerous ground. "After a while, I started seeing you come in every morning, always alone, always so serious. I watched you working late, barely ever smiling, and I began to understand what Doña Elizabeth meant about the walls around your heart." Victoria felt exposed, as if Miguel could see through every mask she'd ever put on. "You've been watching me for 3 months, she said quietly. "I've been caring for you for 3 months, Miguel corrected gently. "There's a difference." In that moment, Victoria understood something that had haunted her for years. The feeling that someone was looking out, that she was not completely alone in the world, had never been paranoia or imagination. It was Miguel, honoring a promise to the woman who had been a mother to them both, in their own way. "What else did my mother say about me?" she asked, surprised by her own vulnerability. Miguel smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no hesitation in his eyes. "She said you were afraid to love because you believed everyone you loved would eventually leave. She said you built an feel powerful, but deep down, all you really wanted was someone who would stay." Paul. "And she said that when you finally let someone in, it would be forever." Victoria felt as if she were seeing herself through her mother's eyes. It was terrifying and freeing all at once. "And you?" What do you think? Miguel looked her straight in the eye, and Victoria saw a quiet courage she hadn't expected. I think Doña Elizabeth was right about everything, he said, and I think she knew we both needed each other. In that moment, in the quiet of the office, as Chicago began to wake below them, Victoria Sterling felt the first wall around her heart start to crack. The first obstacle arrived 3 days later, wearing a $3,000 gray suit and carrying an Italian leather brief. Richard Blackwood, Director of Human Resources at Sterling Industries, knocked on Victoria's office door with the urgency of someone bringing bad. Victoria, we need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him harder than necessary. Victoria looked up from her financial reports, but her mind was still on the conversation she'd had with Miguel the morning before. For the first time in years, come into the office, smiling, and people had noted. What is it, Richard? Blackwood set the briefcase on her desk and opened it with precise, deliberate movements. We received an anonymous tip about irregularity with the outsourced cleaning. Apparently, some of the employees have been working with falsified documents. Victoria felt her blood run cold, but she forced her face to remain neutral. And what does this have to do with me? Everything, Richard replied, pulling a photo from the brief. It was a grainy surveillance camera image of Miguel entering the building. This man, Miguel Herrera, is under investigation by immigration authorities. We have information he's been using forged documents for years. Victoria felt as if someone had yanked the ground out from beneath, but she forced herself to stay calm. What's the protocol in these situations? Immediate termination and full cooperation with the authority, Blackwood said, watching her reaction close. But there's a bigger problem. What problem? The security cameras show you've been in direct contact. Long conversations, outside business hour. Richard leaned forward. Victoria, do you understand the legal implication if it comes out that you knew about his situation and didn't report it? I didn't know anything, Victoria lied, each word burning in her throat. Then you won't have a problem letting him go today, Richard concluded, closing the brief. I've already called security. They'll escort him out of the building as soon as he shows up for his shift. Victoria felt her world crumbling around. Richard, is that really necessary? Can't we just reassign him to another position? Blackwood frowned. Victoria, are you okay? Since when do you care about the cleaning staff? The question hit her like a slap. That was exactly who she'd always been, a cold executive who never cared about the little employee. But now, the thought of Miguel being humiliated and deported made her feel physically ill. I just think we can handle this more discreet, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Not when there's a federal investigation involved, Richard shot back. Victoria, you need to distance yourself from this complete. Any association with undocumented workers could destroy your reputation and the company. After Richard left, Victoria sat alone, crushed under the weight of an impossible choice. She could protect Miguel, but it would mean risking everything she'd built. Or she could protect her empire and let the man her mother had loved like a son be deported to a country he hadn't seen in over 15 years. She picked up the phone and dialed the number for the cleaning. I need to speak to Miguel Herrera immediately, she said when someone answered. Ma'am, Miguel isn't working today. He called in sick. Victoria hung up and felt panic rising in her chest. Miguel never missed a shift. He must have found out about the investigation. Without thinking, she grabbed her car keys and left her off, ignoring the startled looks of her employees. She didn't know where Miguel lived, but she remembered him mentioning that he always took the bus from Roosevelt Street Station. Victoria Sterling, who hadn't driven her own car in years, cruised through the streets of Chicago, searching for a man who had become more important to her than her entire empire. She found him 2 hours later, sitting on a bench in Grant Park, staring out at Lake Michigan. He was holding an old backpack in his lap and looked like he'd aged 10 years since the last time she'd seen him. Miguel called, approaching slowly. He turned and she saw that his eyes were red. Miss Sterling, you shouldn't be here. I heard about the investigation. She's sitting beside him on the bench. Richard told me everything. Miguel let out a bitter laugh. Of course he did. He wants to make sure you don't get hurt by knowing someone like me. Miguel, I can help. I can hire the best lawyer. No, he cut her off, his voice firmer than she'd ever heard it. You can't get involved. Doña Elizabeth made me promise I would take care of, not let you ruin your life because of me. Victoria felt tears burn in her eyes. You don't understand. I don't care about the money or the company. None of it matters if what? Miguel asked, turning to face her fully. If I lose you too, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop. The silence that followed was full of everything they hadn't said in the past few days. Victoria knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back. Victoria, Miguel said softly, using her name for the first time. You have a life, a future. I'm just someone your mother asked to watch over. No, Victoria shook her head, her voice cracked. You're so much more than that. I'm an undocumented immigrant about to be deported. Miguel interrupted. And you're one of the most powerful women in Chicago. Our lives can't mix. It felt like he'd ripped her heart right out of her chest. "So that's it? You're just going to disappear?" Miguel opened his backpack and took out Elizabeth's yellowed letter. "Your mother gave me this, so I'd look after. I'm giving it back." He placed the letter in Victoria's trembling hand. "My part of the promise is done. You don't need me anymore." "That's not true," Victoria said, pressing the letter to her chest. "I need you. For the first time in 15 years. I don't feel alone in the world." Miguel stood slowly, as though every movement hurt. "Then you'll understand why I have to go. Because if I stay, you'll lose everything. And I can't let that happen." He started to walk away, but Victoria stood up and caught his arm. "Miguel, wait, there's something you need to know." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I don't care about the money," her voice break. "I care about you." Miguel closed his eyes and she saw a single tear slide down his. "I care about you too, Victoria," he said quietly. "That's why I have to leave. If you believe true love can overcome any obstacle, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Follow the rest of this story." He gently pulled free of her touch and walked toward the bus station, leaving Victoria alone in the park with her mother's letter shattered heart. That night, Victoria Sterling returned to her empty office and, for the first time since her mother's death, cried until there were no tears left. 3 weeks had passed since Miguel disappeared from Victoria Sterling's life. 3 weeks of an empty office, cold coffee waiting for her every morning, and wilted flowers that no one replaced. The silence had become deafening. Victoria tried to slip back into her old routine: endless meetings, corporate decisions, business dinners with men in suits who talked about profits while she pretended to listen. But something fundamental had shifted inside her. It was as if Miguel had taken with him a part of her soul she hadn't known was there. Richard Blackwood had considered the matter closed. The outsourced cleaning company was replaced. New employees with thoroughly verified documentation took over the nights, and Sterling Industries kept running like a well-oiled machine. As far as anyone was concerned, Miguel Herrera had never existed, but Victoria couldn't forget. She had quietly hired a private investigator to find. The report arrived on a rainy October morning, sealed in a manila envelope she held for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to open. Miguel was in an immigration detention center in Eloy, Arizona. He'd been awaiting deportation for 2 weeks. The investigator had attached a grainy photo taken through the barbed wire fence. Miguel in an orange uniform, thinner, with dark circles under his eye, but still carrying that quiet dignity she'd come to admire. Victoria closed her eyes and saw again her mother's face in the portrait on her desk. Elizabeth Sterling had spent her last years supporting humanitarian causes, donating millions to organizations that helped immigrants. Victoria had always assumed it was just a philanthropic phase, a way for her mother to feel useful after retiring. Now she understood. Elizabeth hadn't just been giving away money. She'd been investing in people like Miguel, people the rest of the world preferred not to see. Her mother's yellowed letter remained in her desk drawer, read and reread so many times that Victoria had memorized every word. "You carry in your heart the key to her happiness," Elizabeth had written to Miguel. But what if it was the other way around? What if Miguel was the key to the happiness Victoria had never known she was searching? That afternoon, she cancelled all her meetings and drove to the Sterling estate where she'd grown up. The property had stood empty for years, maintained only by a team of caretakers who came twice a week. Victoria walked through the gardens Miguel had once tended as a young man, trying to picture her mother and him working side by side among the roses. It was in the shed out back that she found it. Hidden behind dusty garden was a wooden chest Victoria had never seen before. Inside, she discovered a collection that made her heart stop. Dozens of letters Miguel had written to her mother over the year, all in Spanish, all carefully kept by Elizabeth. Victoria didn't speak Spanish fluent, but she could understand enough to see that the letters told the story of a young man who had found a second mother in Elizabeth Sterling. Miguel wrote about his fear, his dream, his attempts to bring his sister from Honduras, and always his gratitude to the woman who had given him a chance when the world had turned its back. But it was the last letter, dated just 2 months before Elizabeth's death, that made Victoria break down in tears. Doña Elizabeth, Miguel had written, "Today I saw your daughter in the garden. She was looking at the rose planted together, but she seemed so sad. I want to help, but she doesn't see me. It's like I'm a ghost. Maybe it's better this. People like me don't belong in her world, but I promise I will always look after her from afar. The way you taught, she is your greatest work of art, even if she doesn't know it." Victoria pressed the letter to her chest and finally understood the depth of Miguel's sacrifice. He hadn't cared for her out of obligation or a promise alone. He had loved her silent, knowing he could never speak that love because of the chasm that separated their lives. That night, Victoria Sterling made the most important decision of her life. She called the best immigration law firm in Chicago and hired a team of 5 attorneys. It didn't matter what it cost. She would get Miguel out of the detention center and fight for his legal right to stay in the United States. But when the lawyers returned with their initial findings, the news was devastating. Miguel had signed a voluntary departure. He would be sent back to Honduras in 72 hours. Why would he do that? Victoria asked, her voice breaking. Most likely to avoid a 10-year re-entry ban, the lead attorney explained. If he fought deportation and lost, he wouldn't be able to return for a decade. With voluntary departure, he might have a chance to apply legally in the future. Victoria felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Miguel was sacrificing himself again, this time to keep alive even the faintest possibility of a future that might never come. She had 72 hours to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. Victoria could accept Miguel's decision and go on living as a successful exec, surrounded by luxury and empty of love. Or she could risk everything, her reputation, her company, her social stand, to save the man who had become more important to her than any professional triumph. In the early hours before dawn, alone in her penthouse apartment, Victoria Sterling looked out at the city she had conquered and realized that all the bright lights in the world weren't worth a single genuine smile from Miguel. She picked up her phone and made a call that would change everything. Richard, it's me, Victoria. I need you to call an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. I'm going to make an announcement that will shake this company. Victoria, it's 3 in the morning. What's going on? I'm making the choice my mother would have, she said, ending the call. For the first time in weeks, Victoria Sterling slept peacefully. She had found her answer in the letter of a wise mother and in the quiet love of a man who had risked everything to care. Now it was her turn to risk everything for him. The conference room on the 50th floor of Sterling Industries had never witnessed a scene like this. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, Victoria Sterling walked into the space where 12 men in suits were waiting, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Richard Blackwood sat at the head of the table, visibly tense about what was coming. Victoria didn't sit down. Instead, she stood at the front of the projection screen, holding a folder filled with docs that would change everything. Gentlemen, she began, her voice firm as it carried through the charged silence. I've called this meeting to announce fundamental changes at Sterling Industries. Changes some of you will no doubt consider controversial. The senior board, Harrison Webb, adjusted his glasses. Victoria, we hope this isn't something that will compromise our position in the market. Victoria smiled, though there was no warmth. On the contrary, Harris, I'm about to elevate our position to the level my mother always dreamed this company could reach. She clicked the projector remote, and the first image appeared, the logo of a new division, Sterling Foundation for Immigrant Rights. The silence in the room thick. Effective immediate, Victoria continued. Sterling Industries will dedicate 20% of our annual profits to fund legal assistance for undocumented immigrants. We'll hire the best immigration attorneys in the country and offer free representation to those who can't afford. Richard Blackwood shot to his feet. Victoria, have you lost your mind? This is corporate suicide. Sit down, Richard, Victoria said coolly. I'm not finished. The next slide displayed architectural plans for an apartment complex. We'll also be constructing a transitional housing center for immigrant families in the process of legalization. It will be located on a property I purchased this morning, 2 blocks from here. The uproar was immediate. Voices overlapped in angry protest. Chairs scraped across the floor as board members stood up. Harrison Webb slammed his fist on the table. This is unacceptable, he shouted. You're dismantling everything your father built. Victoria felt something ignite in her chest. My father built a company. My mother built a legacy. I'm here to honor that legacy. And what if the shareholders revolt? Another board member demanded. What if the stock value collapses? Then we'll find out who actually believes in the values this company claims to represent. Victoria answered even. Anyone who wants out is welcome to sell their share. I'll buy them all. The silence that followed was thick with shock and disbelief. The cold, calculating executive they knew had vanished. In her place stood a woman they didn't recognize, a woman ready to risk billions for Prince. There's more, Victoria said, advancing to the next slide. I'm creating a full scholarship program for the children of immigrants. It will cover everything from high school through graduate degree, including housing and meal. Richard Black looked pale. Victoria, please think about what you're doing. One emotional decision could erase decades of work. This isn't an emotional decision, Victoria said, her voice rising with conviction. It's a moral, and if you can't see the difference, maybe you're not the right people to be in this room. She clicked the remote last time, and the image that appeared made several board members lean back in their chair. It was the photo of Miguel in the detention, thin, exhausted, but with his dignity still intact. This man, Victoria said, her voice breaking just slightly, cared for my mother in her last year. He treated her with more love and respect than many people in this room ever did. And now he's being deported because our society has decided his humanity is worth less than our comfort. Harrison Webb stood again. Victoria, you're talking about a criminal. He's in this country illegal. He's in this country desperately. Victoria correct, her words sharp as a blade. Like millions of others fleeing violence, poverty, hopeless, and instead of extending a hand, we build walls. She walked over to the window, overlooking Chicago, the city that had become her kingdom. My mother left me a letter, Victoria continued, not turning around. She said I would build walls around my heart, but that someone would teach me how to tear them down. That person is being deported in less than 48 hours. When she finally faced them again, there were tears in her eyes, but her posture was unshakable. So here's my final proposal. You can support these changes and help Sterling Industries become a force for social transformation. Or you can try to remove me as CEO. But know this, if you choose the second option, I will liquidate every share I own and use every cent to create an organization even larger and more powerful. The silence stretched on, heavy and electric. Victoria could hear the old clock on the wall tick, each second striking like a hammer. At last, Harrison Webb let out a long sigh. Victoria, are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Once we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, she replied. Richard Blackwood shook his head slowly. And if this fails, if the company can't sustain these programs? Victoria smiled, a real warm smile. Then at least we'll have failed trying to do the right thing. One by one, the board members began to nod, some reluctant, others with growing conviction. When the vote was called, the decision was unanimous. Sterling Industries would become a pioneer, corporate social responsibility focused on immigrant rights. But Victoria knew the real still ahead. She had less than 48 hours to get to Arizona and stop Miguel's deportation. And even if she succeeded, she still had to convince him that she wasn't doing this out of pity or obligation. She was doing it because she had finally understood what her mother had tried to teach. True power doesn't come from how much you can accumulate, how much you are willing to give. That afternoon, Victoria Sterling boarded her private jet to Arizona, carrying the paperwork for an emergency immigration that had cost $500,000 in legal and a heart that had finally learned how to love without fear. If you believe true love can move mountains, tear down walls, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel to see how this story ends. The Eloy Detention Center looked like a fortress in the middle of the Arizona desert. Razor wire fences stretched under the blistering sun, and watchtowers dotted the horizon like silent sentinels. Victoria Sterling had never imagined she would one day stand in front of those gates, clutching a folder of legal docs that had cost more money than most people would earn in a life. Beside her, attorney Carmen Rodriguez was going over the papers for the 10th time. We have a very small window, she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. The deportation flight leaves in 6 hours. If we can't get a court injunction in the next 2 hours, it'll be too late. Victoria nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. On the flight from Chicago to Phoenix, she had reread every letter Miguel had written to her mother. Each word revealed layers of a person she was only beginning to know, a man who had lost everything but never lost his capacity to love. Ms. Sterling? A guard's voice snapped her back to the present. You have 15 minutes for the visit. Victoria was escorted through sterile hall that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. When she entered the visitation, her heart nearly stopped. Miguel sat on the other side of a metal table, wearing the orange detainee uniform. He looked like he'd lost at least 20 pounds, and there was a sadness in his eyes she'd never seen before. When he saw her, a series of emotions crossed his face. Surprise, joy, then something that looked like panic. Victoria, he whispered, standing up slowly. You shouldn't be here. Of course I should, she replied, sitting across. I came to get you out of here. Miguel shook his head quick. No, you don't understand. I signed the voluntary departure. It's better this way. Better for who? Victoria demanded, her voice tight with frustration. For you? For me? Or for the people who think you don't deserve to be here? Miguel looked down at his hand, and Victoria noticed the scar on his wrist looked deeper under the harsh fluorescent lights. How did you get that scar? She asked gently. Miguel hesitated for a long moment before answering. It happened the first time I tried to cross the border. I was 16. The coyote who led he wasn't a good man. Victoria's stomach twisted. What did he do? He tried to assault a girl in our group. She was only 14. Miguel closed his eye. I tried to protect her. He cut me with a knife and left me to die in the desert. My God, Miguel. I walked alone for 3 days before the Border Patrol found me. They deported, but I tried again and again. On the 4th attempt, I made it to Chicago. He looked up at her, meeting her eye. That's when your mother found me. Victoria felt tears sting her eye. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I didn't want you to see me as a victim, Miguel said quietly. I wanted you to see me as as someone worthy of standing beside you. In that moment, Victoria understood something that struck her like light. Miguel wasn't being deported just because he lacked paper. He was being deported because the system had decided people like him were disposable, invisible, unworthy of a second chance. "Miguel," she said, reaching across the table, "I brought the best attorneys in the country. We can fight." But Miguel didn't take her hand. Instead, he pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "Before you decide anything," he said, his voice unsteady, "there's something you need to know. Something your mother made me promise never to tell you." Victoria felt the blood drain face. "What do you mean?" With trembling hand, Miguel opened the envelope, pulled out an old photo. It was a picture of Elizabeth Sterling, but she looked different, younger, wearing simple clothes, holding a baby in her arm. "Your mother wasn't born wealthy, Victoria," Miguel said soft. "She was an immigrant too." Victoria's world stopped spinning. "That's impossible. She came here from Ireland when she was 18, undocked, fleeing poverty. She worked as a housekeeper for years before she met your father." Miguel turned the photo over, revealing an inscription in Elizabeth's delicate handwriting. "For Miguel. Never forget where we came from. Elizabeth O'Connor Sterling." Victoria held the photo with trembling hand. O'Connor. She'd never heard that name before. "She changed her name when she married your father," Miguel went on. "She hid where she came from because she was afraid it would hurt the family business. But she never forgot. That's why she helped people like me." Victoria stared at the picture and saw her mother with entirely new eyes. The elegant, sophisticated woman she'd known had once been a scared young girl, foreign country, fighting to survive. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" Victoria whispered. "Because she was afraid you'd judge," Miguel replied. "She said you'd grown up in a different world, that maybe you wouldn't understand." Victoria felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Her mother had carried this secret alone for decades, helping immigrants in silence to make peace with the part of herself she'd buried. "There's more," Miguel said, pulling out another document. It was an Irish birth certificate with the name Elizabeth Mary O'Connor. Victoria studied the paper, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she was learning. Everything made sense. Her mother's passion, humanitarian work, her natural empathy for the overlooked, and most of all, her love for Miguel. "She saw herself in you," Victoria said. The realization finally dawned, "and she saw you in me," Miguel said softly. "She told me you were her greatest master, the daughter she'd raised with love, and I was the son she chose to save." Through her tears, Victoria looked at Miguel and finally understood why her mother had orchestrated all. Elizabeth knew her daughter needed to understand where she came from, to see past the walls of privilege built around her life. "Miguel," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't care about your documentation. I don't care what anyone said. I care about you." For the first time since they met, Miguel smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "And I care about you, Victoria, more than I should." In that sterile room, inside a desert detention center, Victoria Sterling finally understood what her mother had tried to teach, that true love knows no border, no paper, no social, and that sometimes to discover who we really are, we have to first learn where we came. The court injunction arrived 4:30 in the afternoon, just 90 minutes before the deportation was scheduled to depart. Carmen Rodriguez burst into the visitation, papers still warm from the printer, her face lit by a smile she was trying to keep professional. "We did it," she announced, laying the documents on the metal table. "The judge granted a temporary stay of deportation. Miguel has the right to a full hearing to review his case." Victoria felt her knees nearly give out with relief, but Miguel didn't move, as if he couldn't process the words. "That means I can stay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "For now, yes," Carmen said. "And with the documents Ms. Sterling provided, including your mother's letters vouching for your character and your contributions to the community, we have a real chance at securing permanent legal status." Miguel looked at Victoria with an expression that held gratitude, disbelief, and something deep couldn't quite name. "Why did you do this?" he asked. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Victoria took his hands across the table, not caring about the guard's disapproving stare. "Because my mother taught me that family isn't defined by blood or papers," she said quietly. "It's defined by love. And you are family. You always have." 2 hours later, Victoria stood outside the detention center when Miguel finally stepped through the front door, carrying the same battered backpack he'd arrived. He blinked into the golden Arizona sunset as if he couldn't believe he was free. Victoria ran to him and for the first time embraced him without hesitation. Miguel wrapped his arms around and she felt in that moment she had finally come home. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "Thank you for seeing. Thank you for taking care of me when I didn't even know I needed," she replied. On the flight back to Chicago, they talked like they never had before. Miguel told her about his childhood in Honduras, about the sister he had lost, about the dreams he had carried quietly all those years. Victoria spoke of the loneliness she'd felt after her mother died, how she had built an empire, filled the emptiness in her heart. "Your mother always said you were stronger than you believed," Miguel said, as they watched the lights of the city approach through the plane's window. "But I think she also knew you needed to learn being strong doesn't mean being alone. Victoria nodded, thinking of the revelation about her mother's Irish roots. She kept so many secrets. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really knew her. You did, Miguel said gently. You knew her heart. The rest were just details she thought she needed to hide to protect. When they arrived in Chicago, Victoria made a decision that surprised even herself. Come with me, she said, taking his hand. There's something I want to show you. They drove to the Sterling estate, the place where Miguel had once worked as a gardener so many years before. The house was dark, but Victoria knew every corner by heart. She led him into the back garden where the rose bushes he had planted were still in bloom. In the moon, the blossoms looked like silver goats dancing in the night breeze. Do you remember this place? Victoria asked. Miguel smiled, brushing his fingers over a rose. How could I forget? Your mother taught me how to care for these flowers. She used to say that every rose needed individual attention, that it wasn't enough to just water them all the same. She was talking about people, wasn't she? Victoria said soft, finally understanding the metaphor. She always was. Miguel nodded. Doña Elizabeth saw the world in layers most people couldn't even imagine. Victoria knelt by one of the roses and began digging into the soft earth with her hand. Miguel watched, puzzled, until she unearthed what she'd been searching, a small metal box buried among the roots. I found this in the attic, she explained, brushing the dirt off the lid. My mother left a hand-drawn map showing exactly where to find it. Inside the box were more letters, some written by Elizabeth to Miguel, others from Miguel to her. But at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of silk, was a simple gold ring, small emerald. It was my mother's engagement, Victoria said, holding the jewel up to the moon. Not the one my father gave, the first ring she ever had, from her first love back in Ireland before she came to America. Miguel looked at the ring with reverence. Why did she keep it? Because it reminded her who she was before she became Elizabeth Sterling, Victoria said. It was her way of never forgetting where she came. Victoria held the ring out. I want you to have it. I can't take this, Miguel protested. It's too important. Not in a material way, Victoria said, but emotional. Yeah, and you're the right person to keep. You understand what it means to carry your story with, no matter where life takes you. Miguel took the ring in his trembling hand, and she saw tears glistening in his eyes. There's something else, she added, pulling an envelope from her pocket. My mother left very specific instructions about what to do if you ever needed help. She set up a trust fund in your name 10 years ago. Miguel unfolded the papers inside and read them in silence. When he looked up, he was openly crying. She left enough money for me to bring my family from Honduras, he whispered. My cousin, my uncle, everyone who's left. She knew you'd someday be in a position to help, Victoria said, and she wanted to make sure you had what you need. That night, sitting together in the garden where it had all begun, Victoria and Miguel finally understood the plan Elizabeth Sterling had so carefully set in motion. She hadn't just saved a young immigrant. She had planted the seeds of a family that transcended blood, nationality, and social class. What happens now? Miguel asked, turning the emerald ring between his fingers. Victoria smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't known in years. Now we build the legacy my mother dreamed together. She looked at the rose bushes they had tended, each one blooming in its own unique way, and knew Elizabeth Sterling would be proud of the family that had grown in her garden. 6 months later, Sterling Industries had become something Elizabeth Sterling could never have fully imagined, but would have wholeheartedly approved of. The 47th floor, once home only to Victoria's executive suite, was now the headquarters of the Sterling Foundation for Immigrant Rights, the largest immigrant legal assistance organization in the American Midwest. Victoria walked the hall that had once been silent and sterile, now filled with voices in dozens of languages. Entire families waited in comfortable lounge. Children played in spaces designed just for them, and specialized attorneys worked tirelessly to reunite loved ones torn apart by immigration policy. At the center of it all was Miguel. He had become the foundation's director of operations. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit and carried a leather brief Victoria had given him for his birth. But the most striking change was the light in his eye. Hope had come back. How are the numbers this week? Victoria asked, finding him in the conference room reviewing reports with his team. We helped 43 families get their status regularized, he said, a proud smile brightening his face. And we have good news about the Morales case. The father will finally be allowed to return from Mexico to be with his children. Victoria nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. Every success story, every family reunited, every person who could step out of the shadows and live with dignity was another quiet victory over a system tried to make them invisible. And the housing center? She asked. We open next week, Miguel said, his eyes shining with emotion. 50 fully furnished apartments, a school for the kids, English classes for the adults, and a job training program. Victoria thought back to the resist faced in the beginning. Some shareholders had sold their stakes, exactly as she'd predicted. Conservative newspapers had criticized her relentlessly, calling her naive and ideologically wrecked, but for every condemnation, there were 10 stories of lives transformed. Foundation's work. There's something else. Miguel, taking an envelope from his pocket. This came today from Honduras. Victoria immediately recognized the hand, similar to Miguel, but more delicate, feminine. It's from my cousin Rose, Miguel explained, his hands trembling a little. She got the document. She and her kids will be here next week. Tears pricked Victoria's eye. Rosa was Miguel's last living relative in Honduras, a widow with 3 young children who had been left behind when he emigrated. For months, they had worked with immigration attorneys to secure humanitarian visas. Miguel, that's wonderful, said, hugging him without hesitation. It wouldn't have been possible without you, he whispered. Without the trust fund, Doña Elizabeth left. Without the foundation. Without you having the courage to trust me, Victoria interrupted soft. We did this together. That afternoon, they drove to the Sterling estate. Weekly ritual now. Victoria had converted the property into a guest for immigrant family transition. She always reserved a few hours on Saturday to walk through the gardens with Miguel. The rose bushes he had planted so long ago now covered much of the ground, forming a fragrant maze of colors and texture. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the stone bench where Elizabeth used to sit and read. Sometimes I feel like she's still here, Victoria said, resting her hand on the smooth surface. She is, Miguel replied. Every time we help someone, every time we choose to see humanity instead of fear, she's here. Victoria pulled a letter from her pocket, one that had arrived that morning. It was from a young Syrian who had been reunited with her family thanks to the foundation. The letter was written in Arabic, but it came with an English translation. She says she wants to name her newborn daughter Elizabeth. Victoria read aloud, her voice catchy, in honor of the woman who made it possible for their family to be together again. Miguel smiled, touching the emerald ring he now wore on his pinky. The ring that had once belonged to the first Elizabeth, the young Irish woman who had crossed the ocean in search of a better life. Your mother would be proud, he said. Our mothers would be proud, Victoria corrected softly. All the mothers who sacrificed everything so their children could have a chance to dream. They sat down on the bench, watching the sun paint Chicago's sky in gold and pink. The city stretched out before them, but Victoria saw it differently now. It wasn't just an empire to conquer, it was a community to care for. Victoria, Miguel said quiet, there's something I've been meaning to ask you for months. She turned to look at him, noticing the tremor in his voice. What do you see when you look at the future? Our future. Victoria thought about it for a long moment. 6 months ago, her future had been a straight, predictable line. More profits, more power, more loneliness disguised as success. Now the future looked like a garden full of possibilities she was just beginning to explore. I see a family, said at last, not just the two of them, but everyone we choose to welcome. I see the foundation growing, helping thousands of people. I see children who live in fear to growing up to become doctors, teachers, artists. Miguel nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And I see you, Victoria continued, taking his hand in hers. I see you becoming the man my mother knew you would be. I see you as the heart of this family we're building. Miguel lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. Then let's build that future together. Let's honor our mothers by creating the world they dreamed. That night, as they walked back toward the house, Victoria realized she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching. It wasn't just love. It was purpose. It wasn't just companion. It was a shared mission. She had started as a solitary executive in an ivory tower, and now she was part of a family that transcended blood, nationality, and social class. A family united by the legacy of a wise woman who had planted seeds of love in the most unlikely soil, trusting they would one day blossom into something more beautiful than she could have imagined. As Chicago's lights shimmered like earthbound stars, Victoria Sterling finally understood what her mother had tried to teach her, that true power doesn't come from how much you can accumulate, but from how many lives you can touch. And that true love knows no border. It tears them down, one by one, until all that's left is our shared humanity. 2 years later, Victoria Sterling stood on stage at the Chicago Convention, facing an audience of 1,000 people. Beside her, Miguel held a microphone in hands that no longer trembled. They had been invited to speak at the National Immigrant Rights to share the story that had transformed not just their own lives, but hundreds of others. When my mother passed away, Victoria said to the hushed crowd, she left behind more than a financial inheritance. She left a map to help us rediscover our lost humanity. In the front row, Rosa, Miguel's cousin, held her youngest daughter, a 2-year-old who had been born in the United States, carried in her eyes the same quiet determination Victoria had learned to recognize in her chosen family. Next to her, Rosa's two older children wore the uniforms of the private school the foundation had secured full scholarships for. "My name is Miguel Herrera," he said into the microphone, his voice echoing clear and strong through the auditorium. "3 years ago, I was invisible. I cleaned offices at night, lived in constant fear of deportation, and believed my worth as a human being was determined by a piece of paper." Victoria watched Miguel's face as he spoke, seeing in him the man her mother had recognized from the beginning, someone capable of inspiring others through the simple power of his survival. "Today," Miguel continued, "I run an organization that has helped over 2,000 immigrants regularize their status. But more important than that, I have learned that our dignity doesn't come from documents or social status. It comes from our ability to see each other as family." The audience erupted into applause, but Victoria was focused on something even more profound. In the third row, she spotted a young Syrian woman who had arrived in the country just 6 months earlier, holding her little girl's hand. The child wore a blue dress Victoria had picked out herself, and her wide eyes glowed with the curiosity of someone discovering that the world could be a safe place. After the talk, they were surrounded by dozens of people eager to share their own story. A woman from El Salvador told them how the foundation had reunited her family after 5 years of separation. A young man from Guatemala proudly showed them his engineering degree earned through the scholarship program Miguel had designed. But it was one particular conversation that stayed with Victoria forever. An elderly woman approached her with hesitant steps. Her hair was white as snow, and she held an old photograph in trembling hand. "Ms. Sterling," her accent thick, "I knew your mother a long time ago." Victoria felt her heart. "You did?" The woman handed her the pic, revealing a faded image of Elizabeth Sterling as a young woman, wearing simple clothes and standing among other women in what looked like a shelter. "I worked at an immigrant resource center in the 1980s, the woman explained. "Your mother came every week, always quiet, always bringing food and clothes. She never shared her real name. She only told us to call her Beth." Victoria held the photograph in shaking hands, seeing her mother again with completely new eyes. Elizabeth hadn't started helping immigrants only after she'd met Miguel. She had been doing this work for decades, always in secret, always protecting her identity so it wouldn't jeopardize the Sterling family name. "She told me once," the woman continued, "that one day her daughter would understand why it was so important to build bridges instead of walls. I think that day has come." That night, Victoria and Miguel walked the streets of Chicago, the city that had become the symbol of their transformation. They stopped in front of the Sterling Industries building. Everything had begun, torn past lighting across a polished marble floor. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real," Miguel said, staring up at the lights of the office now housed the foundation. "It's real," Victoria replied, threading her fingers through his, "and it's only the beginning." They had married 6 months earlier, in a simple ceremony in the garden at the Sterling estate, surrounded by the family they had chosen, Rosa and her children, dozens of families the foundation had helped, and staff who had become more than colleagues. Victoria had worn her mother's emerald ring, the same one that had belonged to the young Irish who had crossed the ocean, chasing her dream. Miguel wore a plain gold band, engraved with a phrase in Spanish Elizabeth had written in one of her letters, "El amor no conoce frontera." Love, no board. "There's something I want to show you," Victoria said, taking an envelope from her pocket. Miguel opened it and pulled out an official letter from the federal government. As he read, tears filled his eyes. "They want the Sterling Foundation to become a national model," he whispered. "They want to replicate our program in 10 other cities." Victoria smiled, remembering her mother's words about planting seeds that would grow into gardens she would never see. "My mother always said the best legacies aren't left in will," Victoria said. "They're planted in people's hearts." They walked to the park, where they'd reunited after Miguel's near deportation. The bench where he'd tried to say goodbye now bore a small bronze plaque in memory of Elizabeth O'Connor Sterling, who taught us that family is the people we choose to love. "What do you think she would say if she could see us now?" Miguel asked softly. Victoria closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear her mother's voice in the wind rustling the tree. "I think she'd say we finally learned the lesson," Victoria answered. "That true power doesn't come from how much you can accumulate, but from how many lives you touch. And that true love doesn't recognize documents, border, or social classes." That night they went home, not to the luxury penthouse where Victoria had spent so many years alone, but to the modest house they had bought near the shelter, a place where Rosa and the kids could visit any time, where families in transition knew there would always be an open door. Before bed, Victoria opened the journal she had started the day Miguel almost got deported. On the last page, she wrote, "Dear Mom, today I finally understand your lesson. Miguel wasn't just the key to my happiness, he was the key to my humanity. You planted seeds of love in the most unlikely soil, and now they've become a forest sheltering hundreds of families. Thank you for teaching me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives transformed. Thank you for showing me that home isn't a place, it's the people you choose to protect. And thank you for orchestrating the most important meeting of my life, your daughter, who finally learned to love without fear. Victoria. When she closed the journal, Victoria looked out the window and saw Miguel in the garden, watering the roses they had planted together. Each bloom represented a family they had helped. Each bud, a new hope beginning to unfurl. Elizabeth Sterling had been gone for 15 years, but her legacy kept growing. One life transformed at a time, one family reunited, one heart healed. And somewhere among the stars above Chicago, Victoria knew her mother was smiling. Thank you for following this story to the end. If it touched your heart in any way, leave a comment sharing what moved you most. What kind of story would you like to see in the next video? Stories of resilience, love, family, or social change. Your opinion matters to us. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the perfect moment to join our community of people who believe in the power of stories to change lives. The end.